This is the second of a multi-part series where we're going to talk about demographics and how it impacts geopolitics. In part 1, we focus on the basics and how demographics impacts GDP. In part 2, we will continue on expanding those basics and building theoretical knowledge. We'll look at trade and a country's total fertility rate, or TFR. Then we'll start looking at examples. We went through some hypothetical demographic examples in the previous video, so let's go through some more. We talked about this society in part 1. Workers have a lot of debt. They spend more than they make. This is an import-led consumption economy. Lots of young, less skilled workers equals less expensive labor. What if we make this one change? Unlike the other society, this consumption class has lots of cash. They don't yet have parents to support, and they don't have kids to support. So the extra cash goes into consumption. And there's still lots of cheap labor. Other countries really want to do business with them. This country is going through a huge economic boom where the GDP is primarily based on consumption from the consumption class and investment boom from investors abroad. This country, where the consumption class is outsized, is having what is known as a, quote, demographic dividend, and it is a one-time deal. You can do this maybe once a century. So the primary difference here is how much cash the consumption cohort has to spend and the size of the children cohort. And while there's a boost to GDP in country A, there's an outsized boost to the GDP in country B. This is a country in serious trouble. It has expensive labor, small market, you're running out of people of childbearing age, so population replacement is difficult. On the upside, if you look at the GDP equation, there's an economic boom based on investment, net exports, and government spending. This is a country that needs to find a market to sell their goods to, otherwise they are in trouble. So this is unlikely to happen, but since we're doing ridiculous hypotheticals, this is a terminal demography where tons of funds is going to service the retirees. So the debt burden on the economy is high. Capital is rising in cost, and therefore investments and innovation is slowing down. Consumption is low. Their year-over-year GDP is negative and will be for the foreseeable future. Because the economy is contracting and the services are being cut, as services are cut and the economy shrinks, citizens become depressed and disgruntled, sensing there's little hope for the future. This leads to civil unrest. In an environment like this, even fewer people are willing to have children. On that cheery note, let's talk about demographics and trade. You have country A and country B. Country A is an import consumption economy with a large market and cheap labor. They have small investment block, so capital is expensive. To grow, they need cheaper capital. Country B is their perfect solution. It is an export and investment-led economy with the cheap cash that country A needs. And country A helps country B's investments grow as well as provides a market to sell goods to. Said another way, country A provides the markets and labor that country B needs, and country B provides the investments that country A needs. These two countries are BFFs, and their national policies will reflect this. So what happens in this case? Everyone's hungry for stuff. There are few investors, capital is expensive, progress is slow due to scarce capital. There's competition for stuff and capital, and competition leads to conflict. This is one of the reasons why wars break out. There is a competition for goods and capital. Put another way, they're competing for the same things. What about this scenario? Both are export-led economies with tons of cheap capital. But who is going to buy your stuff? In this case, we have a competition for markets. And again, competition leads to conflict. Put it another way, they're competing for the same things. All right, one more concept and we'll look at examples. Let's introduce the TFR. The TFR is the number of children the average woman has in a society. The idea is that in order to keep the population numbers at status quo, the average woman must have 2.1 children. A assuming a heterosexual couple, one kid to replace mom, one kid to replace dad. The 0.1 is contingency planning. This assumes the male to female ratio is 1 to 1. The problem is it is not, and it has never been. The natural ratio of baby boys to baby girls is 105 to 100. Mother Nature wants more male babies than female. Throughout history, when countries clashed, it was the men who were sent to battle, which produced a surplus of women. These days, with fewer battles, there's a worldwide surplus of males. In the case where there's a surplus of females, a TFR of 2.1 works. In the case where there's a surplus of males, the TFR probably needs to be 2.2 or 2.3. Just in case if you want to see the numbers for yourself, this is the US as of 2023. There are more men in the under 45 cohort than women, and the numbers are fairly equal between the ages of 45 to 55. This has never happened in human history and might explain the Andrew Tates of the world. As much as we may not like it, the law of supply and demand applies to the genders as well, and a shortage of women naturally creates incel culture, but that's altogether a different talk. Now that we understand demographic pyramid shapes, GDP, and TFR, let's look at some examples. When you look at demographic charts, pay attention to a few things. First is the shape of the pyramid. The second is the TFR. And the third is the year of the pyramid. The TFR and the year are at the top of the diagram. And ask yourself, what is the investment cohort like? What is the consumption cohort like? If left to their own devices, how fast is their economy growing? What is the future of this country? So in 1955, South Korea had a TFR of 5, and it has the classic pyramid shape. So few retirees, there's a low retiree burden, there's little investment without international aid, so it's a slow growing economy and capital is expensive. The consumption production cohort is a good size, so it has cheap labor, but goods are expensive. Fast forward to 2020, there's a bulge in the population in the investment cohort. There are few babies. Their TFR is less than half their replacement rate, so there's a narrowing at the bottom of the chart. This is a country in need of an export partner. Capital is cheap. There's probably more than a few government projects going on, but they're worried about the future of the country. So here, Japan has managed to improve their TFR over the past few decades, but it's still below replacement. Because their TFR is better than South Korea or Taiwan, they're aging more slowly, but they are still the oldest country in the world. Notice the shapes of the demographies of the countries. What can you deduce about them with regards to their economies, their GDP? What kind of country do they naturally want to cozy up to? So this is India in 2015. It is one of the few large countries that has a replacement TFR rate. However, you can see there's a drop-off starting at about 20 years of age, which in 2024, it's 30 years old. Remember the concept of the demographic dividend. India might actually have one in the coming years. Southeast Asia isn't doing all that great either, but it's better than many places with a TFR of around 2. You can check out the TFR of countries on your own by typing in the country name and the word demographics. So this Wikipedia page belongs to Vietnam demographics. You can also find this info on the worldbank.org website. Here you can see fertility rates just plummet in Malaysia. So here, note New Zealand's shape. It looks like what Zihan calls a quote chimney, or vaguely rectangular. Growth here is slow and steady. Australia has a bulge in their consumption class. What does this mean for them now, and what might their future look like? Brazil, like the Aussies, is having a bit of a heyday and having a bulge in their consumption class. And Argentina, with their TFR of 2.25 and having a more traditional looking demographic pyramid, is doing well, demographically speaking. So knowing what we know, who might be good partners for these two countries? You can see a drop off in Mexico's TFR in the 1990s. Why? Because NAFTA 1 was signed in the late 80s and Mexico started industrializing. We'll talk a bit later about what impacts TFR. So here's Canada in 2020. Maybe this explains why they are so accepting of immigrants. 2022 is the year the majority of baby boomers retire. They're yanking their capital out of the system. The long-term trend is that interest rates have to go up, taxes have to go up. Interest rates have been abnormally low the past 20 years because of boomer capital. Here you can see that the US has a chimney or rectangular demographic shape. Notice the boomer bulge and the millennial bulge. Notice Gen X and Gen Z, they have an indentation. Why is this shaped like this? Well, in general, a large generation begets a large generation. So in general, the parents of millennials are the boomers and the parents of Gen Z is Gen X. So what this means for you. Tax rates will skyrocket to fund boomer retirement benefits. The people most impacted by this will be Gen X because they are in the investment class. And because the two largest voting blocks are the boomers and the millennials will vote with their parents to keep the boomer benefits, and Gen Xers are a bit screwed. The good news is that millennials are America's secret weapon. Millennials are currently the consumption and production cohort. When millennials finally age into the investment class, the economy will recover. America is the only country that has a sizable millennial cohort. So pay attention to demographic charts of countries to see the size of their millennial cohorts to see what I mean. So let's look at Europe. France is doing reasonably well, all things considered. They have the rectangular chimney demographic, and their TFR is not great, but not god-awful. Let's pause here for a moment. Remember the trade demographics, where you have country A and country B and how they might either become BFFs or compete with one another. Let's pretend Germany and Italy are isolated and trading with only one another. What challenges would they encounter? And remember what I said about the US being the only country with a large millennial cohort. Look at Germany and France's millennial cohort. The problem is not limited to Germany and Italy. Take France out of the equation and the entirety of the EU is having demographic challenges. In fact, take the US out of the collective Western countries, and it's clear everyone is having demographic challenges. Again, notice no millennials. So who has the best demographics on the planet? Countries in Africa and the Middle East have the classic demographic pyramid. In part 2, we continued building our theoretical knowledge. We looked at trade and a country's total fertility rate, or TFR. In part 3, we'll look at what causes birth rates and forecasting, and if we get to it, globalization and demographics. I'll see you there.